Well, I'd like to say good evening
Yeah.
to everybody who is there. Thanks. Oh, Paul Reagan is coming. All right. Welcome, Paul. Thanks for joining us. Well, uh, so good evening, everyone. It's a great pleasure for us to have you all here for this first session of the seminar entitled Law in the COVID-19, co-sponsored by University of the Itajaí Valley, our glorious Univali, and Delaware Law School. And actually, this is another step of this very solid partnership that we have developed, these two institutions, but most of all, these people that are here this evening. Like, as we always say, institutions are very important for to make things happen, but the most important thing are the people who make it really happen. So I want to speak a lot. I just like to make a short, a very brief presentation of how we are thinking of the development of this virtual event. Uh, it was constructed, it was built by professors from Univali and from Delaware Law School, and I'd like to thank Erin Daly, James May from Delaware Law, and Gilson Jacobson, Orlando Zanon, Natamy Bonissoni, and our SJD candidate, Ana Luisa Cousani, for making this possible. Uh, it's a series of events, a series of discussions, of panels, starting today, each time a different topic. The first one is human rights. And then every Wednesday from now on until the end of June, we believe, we'll have discussions like that. So we can already say that next week, May 6th, the topic will be environmental law. And then May 13th, we'll have business and regulation. And then afterwards, we have public health, migration, judicial system, and maybe some more topics that may arise. So the idea is to have one professor from Delaware Law and one professor from Univali, with a moderation of one from either one or the other, and not to have presentations, but discussions. So the idea is that we have like a talk, a chat, and that people can make questions, written questions, so that the members of the panel can answer. And also, we think of the panel lasting not longer than 1 hour, so that we can make the best of it during this hour. So this is it. We hope you enjoy this meeting, and we hope you come back next week and on the others, because this is a very good opportunity in this period that everybody's at home, or at least most of the people are at home, to discuss important issues and to make comparisons between the situation in the US and in Brazil, and how each country is dealing with the pandemic. So I'll make a short presentation of the two professors that are giving us the honor to be with us this evening. And starting with Erin Daly, who is a professor of law at Delaware Law School and director of the Global Network for Human Rights and the Environment. She is the executive director of Dignity Rights International, a non-governmental organization dedicated to protecting the dignity rights of vulnerable people around the world, which she runs with Professor James May, our colleague, our friend that is also here with us this evening. With him, Professor May, she is the author of numerous publications on environmental constitutionalism, environmental human rights, and dignity rights, including a forthcoming casebook on dignity law. Well, thanks, Erin, for being with us. Professor Natamy Bonissoni has an LLM and SJD from Univali. The second one, the SJD, as a part of a dual degree program with the University of Perugia. Her graduate studies were in constitutional, state, and religious freedom at Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie in São Paulo. She's a professor at Univali, and now she occupies a position, a very important one, and we're very proud of her, because now she is the General Coordinator on Human Rights Education of the Ministry of Women, Family, and Human Rights. So these are the short CVs of our professors, and I thank you both very much for starting this series. And I won't say anything else. We have a schedule that we built together yesterday, starting with federalism in Brazil and in the US, and then going to rights and the violation of rights, constitutional rights, and etc. So I give you the word and thank you very much, and thank for the audience who is, well, now we are around 50 people jumped in, who has already jumped in. So thank you to everyone. Erin, would you like to start?
Sure, I'd be happy to. I assume that audio is fine. This works?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. All right, just
Yes.
wanted to check. So first of all, let me start by thanking you, Marcelo, and Natamy and Jilson for sort of, and others, but especially the three of you for sort of keeping this partnership between Univali and Delaware Law School alive and always vibrant and always dynamic and always full of new projects and new ideas. And it's just a really wonderful thing, as we've sort of said over the years, that a true friendship has developed among us, and it's really a pleasure. I also just want to say that as I look down the list of other participants in this, I see a number of names that I recognize, and it just gives me sort of such a thrill to know that some of these students that I've seen and some of the names that I see here are people that I've met several times now, sometimes in Brazil, sometimes in the United States. So it's a really very sort of warm relationship there. So thank you. It's great to see names of people. It's great to see you, and great to be a part of this really important project that we're doing. So with that said, we thought we would start with the question of federalism, because as we discussed the issues, we've had several sort of meetings, the group of us, about sort of what to think about, what to talk about. And one thing we realized was that although we both are in federal countries that have federal systems that have a division between the federal and the state authorities, sort of vertical separation of powers, some might call it, the assumption, the constitutional structure and the assumptions behind those federal systems are different in each country. So in the US, as many of you know, I'm sure, but just to sort of cover real quickly, the states have a certain sovereignty that they had prior to the creation of the federal government. And structurally, the states, delegates from the states created the federal government, and the states ratified the Constitution, and that created a very limited federal government. And so states retain sort of, as I said, residual sovereignty. And what that means is that they have this police power, this general police power that may be defined in their constitutions or may not be. And it's a general state police power to protect the health and welfare, sometimes the health and welfare and morals of the people. So the states sort of have this very broad general authority to act however they think is best to protect the health and welfare of the people. The federal government operates by enumerated powers, by essentially a fairly strict list of enumerated powers. One broad area of authority, the Commerce Clause, which allows the federal government to regulate in the area of in anything that affects interstate commerce. And so, as you can imagine, that can be a pretty expansive power. Otherwise, the federal government can get involved in a lot of things through its appropriation power. So when it spends money, it can impose conditions on that spending, which have sort of the essential function of regulation. But otherwise, we think of the states as having a broad power and the federal government as having this limited enumerated power. Then there's also things that we might want to talk about separation of powers, that is between the president, the executive, and the Congress, but we can leave that. I'll let Natamy talk about federalism first.
Thank you, Professor Daly. First of all, I really would like to thank Professor Dantas. It is a pleasure to be also with you here. I have had the pleasure of working closely to you in the last couple years, and you're a person with whom I have learned a lot. And I also would like to thank to Professor Daly and Professor May for also being here with us. Both of you are great names on human indignity, right? So for me, it is a huge pleasure to be here with us and also to have the opportunity to keep learning with you. And also say hello to our students. We're not so close right now, unfortunately, but I'm very happy to see and meet some of you again. Well, as Professor Daly shared before, the U.S. Federation emerged from the Union of Sovereign States. So when they were freed from England, they had autonomous states that came together in order to form the United States. But this didn't happen in Brazil. And it's very interesting if we can get back and think almost 500 years ago, counting on the history of Portugal. We always had a centralizing tendency. In Portugal, the central power was centralized in the head of the king. And it was so strong that the nobles that time, they were always weak. And this worked in a different way as always working in the rest of Europe. And when the Portuguese arrived in Brazil, they adopted the same type of power as they applied in Europe. So we had the Brazil Empire, we had our republic, but we also had a vocation for decentralizing power. But a big shift occurred in the 1988 when our current constitution adopted, recognized in fact, states and municipalities as entities of the federation and having the same legal status. So we can realize that our federalism model is very unique. So while in the US, the constitutions of the states are independent of the federal constitution, our states' constitutions and all the national laws, they must be subject to the federal one. So although the power is not centralized in the federal government, and that the states and the municipalities, they have their own government and relative autonomy in local affairs, all laws and decisions, they must be submitted to the constitution, to the federal one. And this is very important. We realize this difference right now because having this perspective from the beginning, we're going to understand how everything that's happening and is related to everything that we're going to talk from now on is related to the way of how our federalism models were developed. So in a nutshell, even though we are a federation, the autonomy that our states and municipalities have, they still face some constitutional limits that really need to be respected and observed.
And if I could just sort of add one point of comparison to that I didn't say earlier, which is that in our federal system, while the states do retain the sovereignty and the states have their own constitutions, their own form of government, and they exercise their own police powers independently, they are all subject to the federal constitution and to federal law. So we do have that sort of overlay of federal constitutional rights that governs everything that the states do and the municipalities do as well.
Okay. It is interesting to notice because our constitution is very extensive. We have 250 articles, so it's a very informative document. And however, one of the parts that we mostly study and teach during the law school here in Brazil is the famous 5th article, which presents the list of the fundamental rights and guarantees. It's our Bill of Rights. And what is interesting in this case is that these rights and guarantees, they were made to be untouchable. So they are known as untouchable rules, and they cannot be modified under any circumstances in order to protect our democracy and also the balance between the powers. So all of our state rules and even the municipality rules, all of them need to pay attention not only to the Constitution itself, but also especially to this Bill of Rights. And it's also interesting that we do not have all of our rights inserted in this only article. Most of the rights that we will talk tonight, they are also inserted in the 6th article of our Constitution, and they are characterized as social rights. So the education, health, food, work, housing, they are all inserted in a group of rights that need to be protected by all of the national laws and especially by the municipalities and states' constitutions.
So by contrast, in the United States, most of the rights that are sort of known as individual rights are in the Bill of Rights. The 1st through 8th or 10th, depending on how you phrase it, amendments. And they are part of the Constitution since 1791, so they are the rights that were recognized by the founders. We haven't updated our constitutional text with respect to those fundamental rights very much since then. In certain ways we have. In particular, after the Civil War, we added an equal protection clause and several other voting rights and other kinds of rights protections. But the rights that are in our Bill of Rights are civil and political rights, primarily. We do not have a constitutional right to education. We do not have a constitutional right to health, to food, to work, to housing. And we do not have a federal constitutional right to human dignity, either as an individual enforceable right or as a sort of foundational value of the constitutional system. So our rights protection is very limited at the federal constitutional level. So what rights exist by statute.
Wow, that's interesting. But it's important to mention that even though we have all of these rights recognized in our Constitution, this does not mean that all of them are being enforced, are being applied. So even though we have all of them beautifully inserted in our Constitution, unfortunately, this does not mean that they're being applied.
Right. That's true everywhere, right?
Yeah, that's true everywhere.
And I think just to focus the conversation a little bit on sort of the particular time that we're in, one of the things that we're seeing is how the crisis that the world is in right now, the COVID-19 crisis, is exacerbating those problems. So it was true before COVID that rights, whether they were constitutional rights or statutory rights, are often violated. In many, many countries, they are violated. In many, many countries, they are, the guarantees are vindicated unequally. Some people have more rights than others. Some people have access to more things than others under the Constitution. So there have always been problems like that in both of our countries and in many other countries around the world, probably the vast majority of countries. But what's happened in the last few weeks or months is the stress on these countries. And what we've seen is an exacerbation of the violation of rights in all different dimensions. And I think it's that fact that really prompted this series of webinars that we thought we wanted to explore, which was how are we seeing, what's sort of the status of rights protection in this time?
Yeah, I totally agree. We're facing a very difficult time, and there is a consensus that this is the biggest challenge faced since the Second World War. So, despite initially being a crisis originated in the health area, its implications are having consequences in all areas of society and also demands urgent responses. But these urgent responses that are being taken right now, they have a long-term implications. So that's why we really need to take a time and reflect on these violations and ponder if these violations, they are constitutional or no, they are worth it or no. So, and if I may start, we know that there's a consensus that there are no absolute rights or freedom. And that when rights are in conflict, we really need to use parameters to make reasonable choices. However, unfortunately, as we have seen in many countries, especially in Brazil, and that's why it's really interesting our talk right now, in order to have your perspective about what's happening in the US. This is not only our concern, but is the concern of the United Nations, the Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, all of them, all of these groups, they share an important concern that governments, they cannot use the panic around the coronavirus to hide their a phrase or a worry about shared by Michelle Bachelet, which is the Higher Commissioner for the United Nations. And she said that the countries that disrespect the rule of law under the pretext of fighting the pandemic are at risk of promoting a human rights disaster. So we can realize that this is a worldwide concern and also emerge a global question. How are we going to balance the public health with other rights, the political landscape, but also the economic crisis? So I guess this is the biggest challenge and the biggest question that we are facing right now.
especially if I may, if I may say something, especially in this case that we don't know much about this virus. I mean, just before we started, the Secretary of State, the Health Secretary of State, was given an interview, and he said he knows nothing. He doesn't know when things will happen. He doesn't know how many people are infected. He doesn't. We don't know. I mean, we don't know anything about this virus. So it's even more difficult to balance rights in a situation like that.
Right. And I think it's also important to understand that the balancing gets really complicated because it's not just a question of balancing health versus liberty. The there are certain rights that are going to be affected, certain sort of conditions of life that are going to be affected just by the virus itself. In the US, as I mentioned, we don't have a constitutional right to health care, and we have health care that's very, very unevenly distributed. And many, many millions of people do not have health care at all. And many millions of others have health care associated just with their employment, which is fine as long as everybody's employed. But as we're facing what's close to a 20% unemployment level, or that may go even higher than that, many of those people, the vast majority of those people, will lose their health care. Because they've lost their job, they won't have the resources to buy additional health care. So there's certain rights that are going to be compromised and stresses that are going to be felt by virtue of just the health situation. And then on the other hand, there's a whole bunch of other rights that might be felt sort of derivatively. The longer the economy stays closed down, the longer people are going to be in economic distress and are going to face hunger, or going to face deprivations of education, deprivations of housing, and all kinds of other things. So what we're looking at is really just a very, very complex situation where a response in one area that might advance a right in one area may have adverse effects on another area. And we also, I think, have to think not just about the short, we have to think about this in terms of time also, right? That this is a crisis that we're feeling now in a particular way. We're all doing this by webinar, and it's a wonderful thing, but we're also sort of feeling the stress of being home and all that that goes along with that. And at the same time, we're talking about lifting certain restrictions to allow more freedom of movement, to allow more liberty in that context. But then we're going to have to see over the next weeks and months and even years how the different rights are going to be affected, and how the next virus is going to affect us also. So we may very well be in sort of a cycle where we're going to see these on a recurring basis. And the responses that we have now may very well affect how we respond to the next ones. The complexity can be overwhelming.
Yeah, I guess you were, I'm sorry, someone would like to talk? No? Okay. Your speech was very precise concerning the complexities of the response that not only the governors, but also the society must give to everything that's happening, because we know that we have a public health problem. However, we're also seeing that people are being arrested, are being beaten on the streets, businesses are being closed, services are interrupted, and many people are quiet. We can totally understand that in a situation like that, it's normal if you do not have the answer, you contest those who are making some decisions. But it's a very hard situation, and that demands urgent answer, but with a long-term consequence. And I just like to share with you that our Constitution is very clear about the restrictions that we may have on the fundamental rights. And it shares that there are two possibilities of when these rights can be restricted or violated by the decreeing of a state of exception. And this state of exception can happen in two ways. First of all, with a state of defense, which is related to restrictions to determined places, and also a state of siege, which is related to the whole national territory. And these both possibilities, they give the federal government the possibility to restrict or limit some rights. However, our president, he started to think about this possibility. Our Bar Association published a note sharing their concerns about this perspectives. So here in Brazil, how everything is working right now. We know that the federal government has the power to rule over these situations. However, our Supreme Court decided that not only, even though the union have this authority to decide what limits should be restricted or not, it also recognized that the states and the municipalities also have the autonomy to decide over it. So even though that the union decides that some services are necessary or some limits cannot be restricted, the autonomy to put this in practice are also shared with the states and the municipalities. Our federal government was not satisfied with this decision, but accepted it. But many governors continue to make their own decisions, setting restrictions and taking into account their local realities. But what is the problem we're facing right now? Today, instead of having the federal government applying restrictions that are not proportional to the states, we're having the states applying restrictions that are not adequate to the reality of some municipalities. And furthermore, we can realize also that these decisions that are made in local level, they also have consequences with national implications. And instead of helping, sometimes they may hinder the national coordination of actions to combat the pandemic, such what happened here in Brasilia. Some vaccines that were coming by truck from São Paulo, they were stopped in the road in the state we have here, which is called Goiás, because the federal road was blocked. So we had a problem in order to try to combat the pandemic that suffered some harm by a local decision. So we're also having these complexities inside of Brazil.
Yeah, in the US, we do not in our Constitution have any state of exception or state of emergency authority. So the framers of the Constitution decided basically that if there are individual rights that are going to exist and if there are limits on government that are going to exist, they should exist no matter what, which is a good thing because the US has been at war for all but 5 years of its history. So it's a good thing that we don't have states of exception except during wartime because it would apply all the time. But what we do have is certain statutory authorization. So the Congress has, over the years, provided the president, the executive, with special and quite expansive authorities during emergencies, and those authorities allow the president to divert funds from something that Congress appropriated to something else, to suspend enforcement of laws. We'll talk next week about environment, and we'll see the effect of that on environmental laws, to do things like shut down radio stations, to freeze bank accounts, to deploy the military in certain ways. And so there's a lot of emergency powers that the president has. And a few weeks ago, of course, President Trump did declare that he was a wartime president and established that we are in a state of emergency through this. So that gives him very expansive powers. If I can just make one comment, because I know that we're sort of coming up on time, and I know we want to leave some time for questions. But Natamy, I was so glad that you raised the issue of sort of civil and political rights also, because we talked at the beginning about social and economic rights. But we need to think also about civil and political rights. So in particular, rights to assembly are obviously going to be, compromised in some way when everybody is under a stay-at-home order. Rights to free speech in some ways may or may not be compromised under certain circumstances. Most specifically for our perspective, we have, as you may know, an election coming up in November 2020, a presidential election, and we have all of our election, typically all of our elections on one day. So in November of 2020, we'll have a presidential election, certain congressional elections, certain Senate elections, but also many state elections dealing with state offices and judges, et cetera, et cetera. So it's usually one very big important day. And one question is how that's going to work if we are under uncertain circumstances, right? These things have to be planned well in advance. We won't know well in advance sort of what the situation is going to be in November. There have been questions about whether the president will declare martial law. There's been questions about whether the election will be postponed. If it does, probably that requires an act of Congress. There have been questions about if elections do go forward as planned, how they would go forward. Will it be necessary to vote in person, which would obviously have different kinds of effects depending on what kind of health situation we're in at that point? What conditions will be imposed on mailing write-in ballots and things like that? So a lot of questions concerning civil and political rights, but especially pertinent questions from our perspective about voting rights in this upcoming election.
I just remember that I guess 2 or 3 weeks ago, one of our senators here in Brazil, he proposed a bill project. And in this bill project, he was trying to protect the right of associations of our political parties. And it's interesting because we also have elections in October, and he were trying to save the meetings, and he was proposing that these meetings still keep happening, but in a virtually way, like online. But it's also interesting that another bill project, they were trying to restrict the right to get together, the right to meet, that we also have this in our constitution. They were trying to restrict, to limitate the right to meeting of the religious groups, the associations, the foundations, but the only group that he did not want to restrict, it was the political parties. So that's also interesting. And there is another right, because here in Brazil is also a fundamental right that has been violated, and a lot. I do not get. I'm always impressed when I see on the news the decrease that our mayors and the decrease that our governors they decree, which is the right to religious freedom. Why? The core of their religious freedom is that they can worship their deities not only by gathering but also through their sacraments, meeting two or three people in order to pray, but also getting together to produce masks. They think that is a social effort that can contribute to their religion, and also to get together to bake and give food and counseling. But what is happening in Brazil? The religious freedom has a lot of perspectives. And when this decrease, they oblige the close of the religious organizations, they're not closing only the possibility of them get together, but the possibility for them to help the homeless people, to counseling, and also to prepare food in order to distribute on the streets. And we have seen this in Brazil, that many religious organizations, they were getting together not to pray, not to worship inside their temples. However, some decrees ordered them to close the temples, so their social actions, they need to end, they need to stop. And this is happening not only concerning to religious freedom, but also the right to work or the right to entrepreneur that we have here in Brazil. During this week was shared in social media. One of the master chef of Brazil, he was distributing food to homeless people in São Paulo. And São Paulo has a decree that all of the restaurants, they must be open. So they needed to stop to help these homeless people because of this decree that says that they must be closed. So we really understand why we need to stop these agglomerations, but what are the limits? And do we have some limits that need to be faced? So are interesting reflections that we may have.
My sense is that in the US, there have been some limitations and some controversies around limitations on freedom of, exercise of religion, mostly around sort of church gatherings and for religious purposes, not the other things that you were talking about, but for religious purposes. So for the and all of this is done locally, right? Local, sometimes by state, but often by the locality. So it's different in every place, and it's, you know, very hard to generalize. But my sense is that there were certain localities where the mayor said absolutely no gathering. And of course, it was Easter recently, and that was a time when a lot of people do want to come together in community. And the restrictions were quite burdensome for many people. Many churches found ways around all this. I mean, what we're doing now and Zoom and these other mechanisms have really allowed people to come together. And so there have been for many churches the opportunity to worship and to gather and to do all the things that they would do if they were together in church in one physical place, but to do them you know, digitally, to do them through video. And food drives and other kinds of things like that have been organized consistent with sort of social distancing guidelines. So food is made and some, you know, distributed in ways that are consistent with the guidelines that we have and the restrictions that we have that still allow people to do what they need to do. So for many people, that they've just sort of accommodated and changed the way they think about the community experience of religion. So
Yeah. This also happened in Brazil. This also happened in Brazil. Before we had this decree that obliged them to suspend their activities, they started to organize themselves in Zoom meetings and something like this in order to protect not only their own communities but also the other citizens.
Yeah.
And also talking about the right that we have to religious freedom, we also have some other rights. The right to entrepreneur, the right to education, and we have a lot to talk. However, I just saw our timing here, and I see that we are almost done. And
is there an opportunity to get questions from the audience?
I think it could be interesting. Where is our moderator?
Marcelo has been in and out.
He left.
Oh,
he left.
Could I
There's
take
no
this
problem.
Could I take this opportunity to just ask? I know that some others on our sort of organizing committee, Jim May, Jilson, and Paul Regan, who's going to be presenting later on. I'm wondering if just any of you have comments that you'd like to make about this.
Yeah, this is Paul Regan. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. I unmuted, but I wanted to make sure there was audio. Thank you for this very interesting conversation. And here in the U.S., a lot of the flashpoints on this issue of political rights, the issues of assembly and protests about this liberty, restraint, and confinement, it's led to some interesting conversations about how far can you go. And I think, Erin, you alluded to it, but our Constitution doesn't say you have the right to assemble unless, of course, there's a pandemic and the governor can say you can't do that. But it's just mind-boggling how important it is when you're in the middle of this epic pandemic crisis that says, okay, stay home, as we've done here. And I'm a pretty strong sort of individual liberties perspective person and have deep suspicion of overstepping by the federal government in terms of individual rights. But on the other hand, like, I'm okay for a season that we will limit. I like to think of I'm not voluntarily doing limits or whatever, but I think if it was sustained for a period of time, I think sort of the DNA of the U.S. culture, I think that you already saw, for example, this weekend in California, they're supposed to not go on the beaches, but it was beautiful out and people are just tired and maybe quarantine weary. But I guess maybe address the constitutional or broaden it to, if you want to call it a dignity right, to sort of, it's one thing to say, let me just say it differently. I'm rambling, forgive me. Had this conversation with my son. It's one thing for someone to say, hey man, if I drink 2 bottles of whiskey a night, that's my business. And I said, well, that's not a very good choice to be making, but you ruin your life, that's on you. I'm going to live. But in a pandemic, if somebody's walking near me with no mask and I don't want them around me, or they're affecting public health, then it seems like the state has parameters and more room to move and make choices to limit the freedom of mobility of people right now. And I guess, how do you square that, or how do you align these constitutional balancing act that Natamy was talking about? I don't know. There's this right to say, hey, I'll do whatever I want, but not when you're endangering the health of others, as far as we understand what we don't know yet about this pandemic. And so sort of a long and rambling way of getting to a point of, does that make sense? Is there this inherent notion that all these individual liberties are subject to some notion of, not a constitutional basis for this emergency, some other way of, most people of goodwill is like, yeah, it makes sense, I'll just stay home, the governor said so. But if it came to like an adjudicated ruling, like what does the U.S. Constitution impliedly provide by way of these temporary limitations? Like maybe Erin, you could speak to that, or Natamy, I don't know.
I didn't know if I really got your point because the speech was a little bit with highs and lows, but I guess I got it. I heard yesterday a very interesting phrase by if we allow accesses in times of exception, the access will overcome the exceptions. And this phrase really made me stop to reflect about the principle of proportionality we have here in Brazil, which is the reasonable principle that propose that we use rational criteria when we evaluate a government action in order to avoid some excesses and legalism. And this principle requires the need of the adequation of this law or decision, the real necessity of it. For example, is there no other less restrictive way of achieving the same objective? And the last thing that this principle requires here is the just measure. Do the advantages that brought up this measure that is pretended to be adopted overcome the disadvantage that these restrictions on rights causes? However, I am not seeing a lot of this preoccupation, a lot of these worries in some decisions that we are having in Brazil, even though we totally understand why we're having each day, for example, the states, they publish different laws, different decrees about the same subject, and this is totally understandable, but we have not seen the applicability of these reasonable measures that can cooperate in order to make the best choices and the best decisions.
Yeah, so let me just sort of say quickly, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Um, um, so Paul, in his question, you know, used the magic word for me, and of course, I do think that a lot of this, that thinking about this in terms of human dignity does help us think about how to balance these rights, because when we're just trying to balance rights in the abstract, it's pretty much impossible to do, right? How do you balance, you know, a health right versus an education right, or a life right versus a liberty right? In the abstract, it's kind of hard to do. But I think a couple of things about it. One is, and just sort of picking up on both Paul's sort of question and comment and Natamy's response, we do have to recognize that when we lose our rights due to an emergency of any kind, it is much harder to get them back afterwards. When rights are restricted because of an emergency, they often stay restricted even after the emergency is over. So I think we need to be say that we're willing to give up certain rights, knowing that they're going to be hard to get them back. And I'm thinking also about things like privacy rights, you know, when we talk about contact tracing, things like that. So there's a lot of different kinds of rights that come into play here, and we should think about how we're going to sort of negotiate them. What dignity sort of helps us think in a couple of ways. One is that dignity does have sort of within it a proportionality principle, a requirement that the burdens that are placed on any person are proportionate to the need. Natamy talked about this sort of in different ways, but one way of thinking about it is dignity, so that you say, well, these restrictions are necessary to meet the health crisis, really necessary.
There
sort of requires is
complex.
attention to equality. Yeah. So we just want to, I mean, I think those are two ways of thinking about how we're going to balance these, the importance of proportionality, but also the importance of treating everybody equally and making sure that we know that the virus doesn't discriminate, but making sure that our social response and our political response to the virus doesn't discriminate either.
Yeah,
I don't know if Marcelo is back or.
I'm back now. Yeah.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Someone took me from the call.
Do we have time for a few questions?
We do. We have a question from André Gurgel, who is an LLM student, and he's asking. He says, "I'd like to hear from you. How do you think the fake news related to the COVID-19 are affecting the human rights, in particular when they are simulated by the government?"
I guess I'm not sure what the question's referring to, what kind of fake news we're talking about, and whose definition of fake news. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of rumors that are going around. I mean, you know, this is something that the entire world is talking about. We're all getting our information from different sources. And I think one thing we want to make sure that we do, this is my own personal bias, but is make sure that we listen to the scientists and make sure that we make decisions that are scientifically well-founded and data-driven, and supportable on that basis, and not sort of that we believe whatever rumor happens to come through our feed. So I think I might say that. I don't know if others want to join in on that.
There was another question from Diego, but I missed it here when I left. Can someone have a look at this? In the chat?
Could you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Luisa sent me. Diego asked that he said that he would like to have the view of the professors regarding the collection of personal data and dignity rights nowadays.
Exactly. Yeah, that was it.
I'm sorry, I lost the audio on that. Could you just repeat that?
He would like to have our view on the let me see it. Where is it? Here. He would like to hear us talk about the collection of personal data as a dignity rights nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting. I don't know if we're talking about the collection of personal data specifically in the context of contact tracing and other things sort of associated with that. If we're talking about the collection of data in the context of this pandemic, I think it's a very, very interesting issue, and that's certainly one of the things that I think we should pay very close attention to when we think about the rights that we are giving up in order to accomplish a public health goal, and how we're going to reclaim them once that crisis passes. I think that there are some people around the world who are working on ways to collect the information that we need, whether it's via Bluetooth or something else, and hold it in a way that does not compromise personal privacy or autonomy, holds it maybe in a decentralized way, holds it, you know, for a very limited period of time for 2 weeks or something like that. So I think that there are people who are thinking about these issues and trying to ensure that we get what we need, but again, in the context of this question of proportionality, we get what we need, but we don't impose burdens that are beyond what we need in order to accomplish the goals. The concern is certainly that that once information leaves our phone, we don't know where it goes, we don't know who has access to it, we don't know for how long, and we don't know what they're going to do with it. So in our country, where we look to Congress to sort of define the authority of the administration through the statutes it writes, we, certainly hope that Congress will write laws that protect personal privacy as much as possible, and that limit the the burdens to the specific emergency. There's also, if I'll just say one other thing, in the U.S., our Constitution applies almost entirely just to government action, so that private entities are not obligated, are not restricted by constitutional rights. There is no constitutional right to privacy, for instance, as against a company. So if it's Apple and Google that are creating something, we don't have the same rights as against Apple and Google that we do have against the government. So there are reasons to want the government to be taking sort of the primary role in this, which is to make sure that constitutional rights apply there. There are other reasons to be sort of cautious about what the government's going to do with that data once they get it. And there's also reasons to think that they already have everything they need and they don't need any more. They already know all about us. So, so these are complex issues, and again, issues that we really rely on experts about, because most of us are not experts in the privacy aspects of technology.
I think Jimmy has a question or wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to try to repeat the questions in the chat box. That was all.
All right, thank you. Thank you. There's a new one from Laudemir. So
No, he
I would like. I can get that now, Natamy. Thank you. Well, oh, that was the question that Diego addressed. Yeah, right. It's the same. So there is another one from Jefferson. I'd like to know the professor's opinion about the obligation to leave home wearing masks. Some states here in Brazil, and many people in Brazil are not even able to buy food. How to balance the duty of isolation to prevent dissemination and the right to come and go? Wow.
Wow. We have
I think we need another webinar for that.
a whole webinar just to answer it. So we have in our criminal code a forgotten article that has been resurrected by some decrees, which says that the person who breaks the government's determination to prevent the introduction or the spread of a contagious disease, they can lead to detention from 1 month to 1 year. And there are some decrees published in some states that are using this article in order to prevent people to leave their houses using masks. However, many other governors and mayors, they are not going to this way. They are making some recommendations, and they are also applying some administrative sanctions like fines. This is a very complex situation, and unfortunately we had yesterday a person died in Curitiba, or a city close to Curitiba, because a man, he did not accept to use the mask. A according to the Supreme Court, the decisions of the mayors and the governors, they are constitutional. However, the measures that are being taken in order to not punish, I lost the English word, but in order to avoid people to use these masks, that are being the problems, because some people are being under arrest and others need to pay fines if they leave without mask. So after the decision of the Supreme Court, I have a lot of doubts how we can balance this right.
Yeah, I think I don't have much to add to what Natamy said. I would say, just sort of highlight, I think, something that you hinted at, but when laws are very general, they can lead to problems of selective enforcement. And not everybody is going to be arrested for or fined for not wearing a mask. It may very much depend on where you live and what the police presence is in that area and other kinds of things. And the burden that's imposed on a person for not wearing a mask may also be disproportionate. So I think that's one of the areas where we really want to pay attention to the inequality issues and make sure that we're imposing obligations in ways that they're not subject to selective enforcement, to sort of choosing where you're going to enforce it and where you're not, but also imposing obligations that are reasonable for people to be able to comply with. So for many people who do not live close to a grocery store, because in the US we have a tremendous problem with what they call food deserts. In very poor areas, there are no good grocery stores, and you have to travel far to get to one, or you have to drive by car or whatever. And so to impose certain requirements on people that they simply cannot abide by is something that we need to really watch for.
I just like to add something to what Erin shared. In Brazil, we have more or less 5,700 municipalities, something like this, or 5,500. And only 1,200 municipalities have confirmed COVID infection. Of course, we have a lot of sub-notifications. However, we need to understand that a state decision that obliges someone to use mask or other restrictions in one state, this decision is going to be obliged to all of the towns, even though to that one that do not have any case of infection. And this is interesting because we are having some problems, especially in Rio Grande do Sul, where the core of the infections are around the capital. But the cities, which are 500 or 600 miles away, they are facing the problems because their commerce are closed. They need to use masks. The kids are having no classes, but they have no infections there. So this is a very complicated situation and very hard to balance.
Yeah. In the US, as I mentioned, I think more and more we're getting sort of distinctions by municipality and by area, where states are able to say, you know, overall, this is the policy in the state, but mayors in different cities or municipalities are able to impose or lift the restrictions that they think are best suited for their local area.
Okay.
We have one more question here from Bruno, SJD candidate. do you believe that these questions of human rights violations should be addressed by constitution or statute changes to try to regulate future similar pandemic situations? Well, we hope not to have future pandemic situations like this one. I don't know if you got it, if you could.
Yeah, I am very scared with more regulations about it. I think that just like what we are facing in Brazil, we also are in a public emergency. And this public emergency allowed many states do not respect our fiscal limit. And also this situation also give many possibilities to the states and municipalities deal with some issues. My perspective from our constitution is that it is very clear when these fundamental rights, they need to be restricted. And now I'm talking about the two possibilities of exceptionalities we can have in our state. But how our president, he didn't decree it, one of them, I see that we're facing some problems that its core, it's on political decisions. So I do not think that we are having a problem concerning regulation, but we are having some politics decisions that is having consequences on these violations on human rights and also to the public health.
Great. Erin, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say quickly that I don't think it's a choice between statutory and constitutional. I think that they both sort of do different things. The Constitution sort of sets the outer bounds. And again, in our case, because we don't have states of exception, it sets the outer bounds for government conduct no matter what. In any circumstance, you always have freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of, certain rights against searches and seizures and things like that. So I think that it's important that those, continue to exist and continue to be applied no matter what the situation may be, give, in different ways given the context. But I do also think that in our separation of power system, the Congress has a very, very important role to play in defining and limiting, if necessary, the authority of the executive. So that in our system, the executive, for the most part, acts pursuant to statutory authority. So Congress passes a statute and it says, here, President, you must do this, or you can do this, or you should do this, and here's some money to do it. But that the President has to stay within that statutory limit. And I think that both of those are important. The statutes obviously are important because they're, at least as compared to constitutional provisions, they're slightly more nimble, right? Congress passes a statute, it can amend it, it can modify it, and it can adapt it to different circumstances. If we have a pandemic again, it won't look exactly like this. It'll, create different questions. And so whatever laws are passed now will be models for, but should be probably amended to suit the needs of the next time. So
Perfect. Yeah, right. Well, I think we're getting to the end of our first session. I would like to give to leave the word open for James May, Paul Reagan, Erin, Daly, and Natamy. If you want to say something as a closing.
The only thing I'll say as a closing is just thank you very much. It's been really quite an honor to be a part of this, and I was, thrilled to sort of think about these difficult questions and have these conversations with you. I'm happy to hear what others have to say, though. But thank you.
I also would like to thank you, and I'd like to say that I get out of this conversation with more questions and more reflections about it.
Jimmy, would you like to say something?
I'll just thank you. That was a fascinating conversation. Well done, and I look forward to the next one. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thank you. Paul?
Yeah, also I just echo the thanks and share Natamy's perspective about my head hurts because I'm thinking so much about things I hadn't thought of before. So it's great because all the questions that I need to think about more. It's a very, very helpful conversation. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's a great pleasure for me personally to moderate this first panel. And I'd like to say that you created a huge challenge for us, for Jimmy and I, and for Paul, and for the ones that are coming, because of the high level of the discussion, of the high level of your thoughts and ideas. So it's great. We started, but if I knew that, I would have been the first.
Well, there's no one better to continue the conversation than you guys. So
yeah,
we're looking forward to it.
Me too. So next week we're waiting for you all, the students and the audience. We had around 70 people during the whole period of the discussion, which is great, amazing, especially concerning the topic, which is specific, the language. So it was great. And I'd like to invite you all for next week at the same time on Wednesday, May 6th. James May and I, with the moderation of Gilson Jacobson, will discuss the impacts of COVID-19 in environmental law. Thanks very much to everyone. You have a great night and a great, it's a holiday on Friday here in Brazil. It's not very different because everyone is at home. But anyway, have a great holiday, the Brazilians, and have a great time, the Americans. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Stay healthy, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you. Bye-bye.